The flower and produce show of Flaxborough, although held under the resonant auspices of the Horticultural Society, had long ago settled into a kind of annual ritual, less remarkable for the displays of marrows and dahlias than for the municipal opportunity it provided to remind the townsfolk of the social order. Councillors' wives in hats of stiff optimism presided over jam tables. Small boys attempted sabotage with crab apples, and the clergy circulated in wary pairs, as though to prevent anyone mistaking their interest in the wine, making contest as altogether theological. It was in the middle of this customary spectacle of rustic reassurance that the incident occurred. Not a dramatic one, certainly not to those present, though it would soon prove sufficient to disturb the tidy complacency of the town. Canon Burrows, vicar of St. Matthew's, had made a brief appearance at the trestle of cakes before vanishing with his habitual puffing sound into the wings of parishioners. Some 30 minutes later, he was seen to confer urgently with Mrs. Porritt, secretary of the Horticultural Society, and to place in her hands a small brown envelope. The handover was observed by at least half a dozen respectable onlookers, any one of whom might have supposed it was a cheque for the church roof fund, or perhaps a hastily lodged entry fee for a chrysanthemum. But Mrs. Porritt did not add the envelope to her ledger, nor did she make any note of it on her little pad. She tucked it with an odd air of deliberate secrecy beneath a stack of unsold programmes. When, at the close of the afternoon, she came to retrieve it, the envelope was no longer there. By evening, the vicarage was the recipient of 3 telephone calls. The first was from Mrs. Porritt, announcing in tones of harassed formality that the note had gone missing. The second was from Councillor Brindle, who, having heard of the disappearance in less than 2 hours, wished to assure the canon that the borough council would be most supportive, if indeed any irregularity had occurred. The third was from a journalist on the Flaxborough Citizen, who asked Canon Burrows whether he had any comment to make on the alleged deficit. The canon, a man better suited to declaiming psalms than fielding inquiries, stammered his way through a series of denials before retreating into silence. By the following morning, Flaxborough was animated with speculation. It was said by the postmistress that the envelope contained £5, destined for the choirboy's new surplices. A butcher's wife suggested, in what she regarded as a whisper, that it had held a note recording private donations, which you may guess were not entirely from parishioners. One version, particularly relished by a knot of pensioners near the bus stop, declared that the vicar had been concealing a second set of church accounts, entirely separate from the official ledgers. At police headquarters, Inspector Purbright received a call from Superintendent Bradley. The superintendent's style, rarely subtle, was brisk even by his standards. "Purbright," he barked, "they're in a state down at St. Matthew's. Something about an envelope gone astray. A ledger, possibly, or 2 ledgers. Anyway, the Archdeacon's been on to the mayor's been on to me, and I'm on to you. Go down there and find out what on earth it's all about." Purbright listened patiently, his pen hovering over a blotter, as if weighing whether to make a note or let the matter evaporate of its own triviality. But the reference to 2 ledgers, repeated as if it were some conjured rumour, persuaded him that the case might not merely consist of misplaced ecclesiastical paperwork. Thus it was that on a cool September morning, Inspector Purbright found himself walking at an unhurried pace up the gravel path to the vicarage, whose windows, large and clear, seemed determined to give the impression of a household with nothing to hide. Inside he was met by the canon himself, pink about the gills and perspiring from a fretful half-hour with his churchwardens. He ushered Purbright into a study lined with books, though the spines bore less evidence of reading than of decorative piety. "My dear Inspector," Burrows began, "this is all really most awkward. There seems to be, well, perhaps you might call it a misunderstanding." Purbright inclined his head with his usual courtesy. "I find misunderstandings can be very illuminating, Canon. Would you like to tell me which sort of misunderstanding we are speaking of?" The Canon sighed heavily, his eyes straying to the desk where two stout ledgers lay side by side, one locked and the other suspiciously new. "It concerns the accounts of the church, Inspector. Or rather, two accounts." And with that faintly embarrassed confession, the first ripple of scandal passed through the tranquillity of Flaxborough. Inspector Purbright had grown accustomed to the way scandal in Flaxborough could take root before most of the town had even spread butter on its toast. By 8 o'clock the morning after his first meeting with Canon Burrows, the missing envelope had swollen in the collective imagination until it resembled nothing less than the vicar absconding with the whole of the diocesan fund. Each retelling passed over fences, across shop counters, and through the rattling doors of buses was embroidered with confident detail by people who had not been within 50 yards of the vicarage in weeks. Mrs. Gloss, who presided over the stationery aisle of Bantock's Emporium with the solemnity of a priestess, was heard to remark that she had seen the Canon purchase 2 bottles of fountain pen ink only a fortnight ago. Blues black, mind you, which is the very shade used by accountants when they are cooking figures. This observation, picked up by a customer who knew her neighbour's brother once kept books for a shipping firm, became by mid-morning a declaration that the Canon had a secret bank account in Hull. The local butcher, Mr. Harbottle, who relished any chance to fatten gossip as he would a prize hog, told 3 customers in succession that the envelope had contained a confession from one of them parish ladies. By the time his assistant returned from delivering chops to the mayor's house, this had expanded into a story that Mrs. Porritt herself had been blackmailed. Meanwhile, Purbright, not one to be hurried by the velocity of town chatter, took himself to his office and considered the 2 ledgers he had been permitted briefly to inspect the previous day. They were outwardly dull things, green cloth bindings, the titles St. Matthew's Accounts and Parish Social Fund, stamped in faded gilt. But what had pricked Purbright's curiosity was not their contents, which appeared superficially honest enough, but the way the Canon's hands had trembled when asked to explain why both existed. The Canon's explanation had been halting, punctuated by moist coughs and appeals to Purbright's understanding of parochial necessities. The parish social fund ledger, he said, was for monies not strictly ecclesiastical, small donations, subscriptions for concerts, proceeds of raffles. These, he argued, had never been intended to pass through diocesan scrutiny. The churchwardens, however, had recently insisted that all finances be consolidated. Hence, the 2 ledgers now lay side by side like an unhappy married couple obliged to share the same pew. Purbright reflected that there was nothing inherently criminal in such duplication. Indeed, most institutions in Flaxborough ran on more than one set of books, though they were rarely so candidly labelled. What did interest him, however, was the missing envelope, the Canon's almost pitiful panic, and the eagerness with which the story had already been inflated by half the borough. By 10 o'clock, the inspector had determined to begin at the Horticultural Society, which, as the scene of the disappearance, might yield something less fanciful than the town's current theories. He found Mrs. Porritt in her sitting-room, a fortress of antimacassars and ornamental tea-sets. She received him with a stiffness born of both indignation and faint excitement. After offering him a cup of tea so strong it might have served as disinfectant, she launched into a recitation of her own innocence. "I did exactly as the Canon asked, Inspector. He gave me the envelope, said it was important, and I put it safely under the programmes. When I went to fetch it at the end, it was gone, not a sign. And I'll tell you this." Here she leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the antimacassars might overhear. People were hanging about that stall who had no business there. I saw Councillor Brindle himself nosying over the cakes, and he wouldn't know a Victoria sponge from a doorstop." Purbright thanked her, nodded gently at each suspicion she aired, and made a note of who had been near the stall: Councillor Brindle, a Mrs. Keeble, renowned for her competitive sloe gin, and a youth called Derek, who had recently been reprimanded for skateboarding across the churchyard during matins. Leaving Mrs. Porrit's with her reassurances ringing like a defensive hymn, Purbright crossed the market square, where knots of citizens were visibly mid-gossip. He caught the eye of Sergeant Love, who had been stationed discreetly nearby under the pretence of traffic observation. Love, with his usual cheerless candour, reported that the most popular version of events now had the envelope containing a letter from the bishop himself, exposing a scandal about choir boys. Purbright only sighed, knowing that in a few more hours the story would likely involve Russian spies and the organist's pension. By lunchtime, he had arranged interviews with Councillor Brindle and Mrs. Keeble, each of whom received him with the peculiar eagerness of those who believe an investigation is a stage for their own importance. Brindle, a florid man with the habit of patting his waistcoat as though expecting it to purr, declared himself shocked that clerical funds should be left lying about like raffle tickets. He denied having touched the programmes, but admitted to glancing over them in the public interest. His chief concern, he told Purbright, was that the borough might be brought into disrepute if financial irregularities were alleged. Mrs. Keeble, by contrast, was a tremulous widow who seemed to regard the inspector's visit as a compliment. She insisted she had gone nowhere near the stall except to ask Mrs. Porritt if the canon had enjoyed her gin entry. She was anxious to add that she had seen young Derek poking about near the tables and muttering that it was all a swindle anyway. It was not until late afternoon that Purbright returned to the vicarage, where the canon awaited him in the study, face drawn and voice husky from nervous repetition of prayers. He confessed, almost in a whisper, that the missing envelope had contained not £5 but 50 in banknotes. "A donation, Inspector, from an anonymous parishioner who wished to support our restoration fund without drawing attention." "Anonymous generosity is easily misunderstood," Purbright remarked mildly, watching the canon's features twist with misery. Outside, as dusk settled on the town, Purbright walked slowly back towards the station. He was no nearer to knowing who had lifted the envelope, but he was beginning to suspect that the theft itself might be less significant than the ferment of secrecy surrounding it. Flaxborough, he reflected, was rather like a pond. Disturb the surface, and the ripples reached far beyond the stone that caused them. The disappearance of a small brown envelope had set half the town into elaborate invention, and somewhere amid that invention, he suspected, lay the first faint outlines of the truth. The canon's revelation that the missing envelope had contained £50 in notes, not the paltry fiver rumour had suggested, was more than sufficient to guarantee that Flaxborough would spend the next week in a state of narrative intoxication. Purbright knew, even as he walked away from the vicarage, that by morning the figure would be exaggerated to 100, and by the following week the town would be debating whether the sum had been guineas, sovereigns, or perhaps a foreign currency smuggled in through Hull. It was not so much the money itself that seemed to exercise the imagination as the thought of concealment. 2 ledgers, 1 official, 1 private. For a town which thrived on gossip as a kind of civic fuel, the idea of hidden books was a feast of the highest order. There was nothing that lent itself to interpretation quite so profitably as the suspicion of secrecy. At the police station, Purbright convened a short meeting with Sergeant Love, whose expression suggested that anything to do with church finances was a form of swindle beyond redemption. "Seems clear enough, sir," Love said, flipping through his notes. The canon kept 2 sets of books, one with the proper accounts, one for whatever sidelining he was up to. The money in that envelope could have been a bribe, or a payment, or what have you. Someone pinched it before it went into the wrong column. Purbright, who was sharpening a pencil with the leisurely care of a man filing away not wood, but idle speculation, looked up mildly. "You find neat explanations very comforting, don't you, Love?" "Comforting, sir, and usually right," the sergeant replied with the grim conviction of one who mistrusted any evidence not tied up with string. But Purbright was not comforted. He had noticed the canon's anguish, which had seemed less about being caught in dishonesty than about being exposed to conjecture. The man's nerves were not those of a thief, but of a parish shepherd terrified that his flock might scatter. That, Purbright mused, was the more dangerous condition. It made him vulnerable not only to scandal, but to the ambitions of those around him. The following day was Sunday, and Purbright, not much given to church-going unless invited by duty, felt a discreet attendance at St. Matthew's might offer more enlightenment than another formal interview. He entered quietly, as the choir struck up a slightly disordered rendition of "Guide me, O thou great Redeemer." The canon delivered his sermon in tremulous tones, clinging to the pulpit like a mariner to a mast. If he mentioned stewardship once, he mentioned it a dozen times, and his gaze seemed to dart uneasily toward the pews where Councillor Brindle and Mrs. Keeble sat with ostentatious attentiveness. What was more revealing to Purbright, however, was the congregation's behaviour. Each cough, each whisper, each exchange of hymn, books seemed freighted with subtext. In the back rows, 2 churchwardens were engaged in an exaggerated pretense of solemnity, their eyes constantly sliding toward the canon as if calculating whether to support or disown him. After the service, Purbright lingered in the porch where gossip formed its thickest eddies. He overheard Mrs. Gloss telling a cluster of parish ladies that the canon's sermon had been an admission in everything but words, while another voice countered that the poor man was being martyred for honesty. There was talk of a parish meeting, of finances being audited, of the bishop himself sending a visitor. In the middle of this, Purbright quietly asked one of the churchwardens, Mr. Hargreaves, to walk with him a little way. Hargreaves, a man whose moustache conveyed greater fortitude than his manner, obliged nervously. "Tell me," Purbright began with courteous neutrality, "what do you make of this business of 2 ledgers?" Hargreaves shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Inspector, it isn't unusual, really, not if you want to keep parish activities from being swallowed by diocesan coffers. But it does look bad, I grant you, and some people—" Here his glance slid towards where Councillor Brindle was booming platitudes into Mrs. Porritt's ear. "Some people like to make capital out of appearances." "Political capital?" Purbright asked gently. "Quite," Hargreaves muttered, before making an excuse about a pressing Sunday lunch. By Monday morning, the affair had reached the Borough Council chamber. Councillor Brindle rose to suggest, in tones of heavy righteousness, that the integrity of all borough-associated institutions be safeguarded by immediate inspection. Though the matter of St. Matthew's finances was hardly within his remit, his motion was carried with gratifying support. The Flaxborough Citizen reported the meeting under the headline, "Clerical Cash, Mystery to be Probed." Purbright, reading this with his morning tea, sighed. He knew that once councillors became involved, facts would be elbowed aside by the lust for speeches. Still, he considered, their interference might at least flush into the open some of the quieter motives that whispered behind the canon's predicament. That same day he paid a visit to the youth Derrick, who was summoned with reluctance to the police station. Derek arrived with hair defiantly uncombed and an expression that sought to combine bravado with fear. "You were seen hanging about the cake stall," Purbright observed without reproach. "Only because I was waiting for Mrs. Porritt to move," Derek said sulkily. "She caught me last month chucking my bike behind the church hall. Said I was a disgrace, so I was going to nick one of her buns just for a laugh. Didn't touch any envelopes, though." Purbright regarded him with the mild patience of a man listening to a cat explain its dietary habits. "You didn't notice anyone else near the table?" "Only that counsellor bloke. He kept patting his pockets like he was checking something, and Mrs. Keeble with her bottles. They were fussing around a lot." Dismissed, with nothing more frightening than a warning to keep his bicycles off consecrated ground, Derek slouched away. By late afternoon, Purbright had assembled his notes, Brindle eager to display moral outrage, Mrs. Keeble fluttering with anxious virtue, Porritt defensive to the point of paranoia, and the canon paralyzed with dread. Each had been close enough to the envelope to have taken it, and each had motives of sorts, not large, not melodramatic, but the kind that thrived in the soil of small town rivalry. As dusk fell, Purbright walked once more past the vicarage. The curtains were drawn, the windows glowed dimly, and the canon sat silhouetted against his study lamp, his shoulders hunched over the pair of ledgers. The sight, oddly forlorn, suggested to Purbright that whatever had been stolen, it was not simply money in an envelope, but a measure of trust. And trust in Flaxborough was always the most negotiable currency. He lit his pipe, struck by the sense that the true significance of the missing note was not in the theft itself, but in the way so many people appeared eager to shape its meaning. Somewhere among the whispers, a hand had taken what did not belong to it. The trick, as always, would be to discover whose silence was the loudest. By Tuesday morning, the tale of the vanished envelope had acquired the weight of a full-blown scandal. The Flaxborough Citizen devoted an entire column to the embarrassing irregularities at St. Matthew's, liberally padded with speculation from those least qualified to offer it. The more lurid accounts spoke of the canon maintaining a secret fund for dubious purposes, while the more charitable merely hinted that administrative carelessness had left parish money exposed. Superintendent Bradley, who had as much sympathy for subtle inquiry as a bull had for porcelain, summoned Purbright to his office. The superintendent was in the habit of treating administrative crises as though they were military campaigns, and he opened the encounter with his usual brusqueness. "Purbright, the council obeying, Brindle stirring it up, the bishop sniffing around, and the citizens having a field day. We need this settled before it gets out of hand. Find the culprit and make it quick." "Which culprit would you prefer, sir?" Purbright asked mildly. Bradley scowled. "Don't be clever. The boy Derek seems an obvious choice. Bad record, cheeky manner, always hanging about where he shouldn't be. Charge him with theft and be done." Purbright's expression remained serene. There is something to be said for a convenient suspect, but convenience is rarely reliable. Bradley, who disliked philosophical replies, waved him out with a snort of impatience. Outside the superintendent's office, Purbright paused to light his pipe and consider the merits of young Derek as scapegoat. It was true the lad had been near the stall and trailed a reputation for minor delinquency behind him like the tail of a kite. But Purbright, who had spent long years observing the gradations of wrongdoing in Flaxborough, knew the distinction between petty mischief and calculated theft. Derek's sulky confession of wanting to filch a bun had carried the ring of shabby truth. A boy capable of chewing was seldom capable of such a tidy disappearance. Still, the public wanted someone to blame, and Derek, with his unruly hair and disdain for hymn books, fitted the part too well, which Purbright reflected was precisely why the truth was unlikely to rest with him. That afternoon he returned to the vicarage for another conversation with the canon. Burrows was more haggard than before, his collar askew, as if the very starch had wilted in the heat of gossip. "They say," he began miserably, "that I have been diverting parish money, that I've set up a fund for, well, heaven knows what. I assure you, Inspector, it is nothing of the sort. The second ledger was merely a convenience. Social events, concerts, the harvest supper, money in and money out, nothing sinister." Purbright let the canon run on, nodding gently, watching the perspiration gather at his brow. "And yet," he said at last, "someone knew that envelope contained more than trifles. How widely have you spoken of its contents?" "Not a word, Inspector. Only Mrs. Porritt was aware. And then only that it was important." Purbright glanced at the pair of ledgers still side by side on the desk. "Yet, Canon, others seem very well informed. Secrets have a way of declaring themselves." Burrows pressed his hands together in anguish. "If only I could discover who took it. Better to accuse me than to have the parish torn apart by rumours." As he left, Purbright encountered Councillor Brindle, arriving in all the puffed importance of civic indignation. Brindle greeted him with a pompous nod before bustling into the console, or perhaps interrogating, the canon. It was plain to Purbright that the councillor considered himself a central figure in the unfolding drama, his role being to deliver weighty pronouncements at every turn. Back at the police station, Purbright reviewed his notes again. He had begun to notice the odd detail that so often offered the slender thread of progress. Brindle's curious habit of patting his pockets when near the stall, remarked upon both by Mrs. Porritt and Derrick. It might have been innocent, but in Flaxborough, small gestures were often more revealing than confessions. The next morning, Purbright asked Sergeant Love to make discreet inquiries at the Midland Bank. Love, though puzzled by his superior's request, returned with news that Councillor Brindle had indeed been in to deposit an unusually large sum the day after the flower show. The clerk, with the discretion of one delighted to be indiscreet, had mentioned the notes were a mixture of denominations rather untidy. It was enough to plant suspicion firmly, though not enough to prove theft. Love predictably pressed for immediate action. "Arrest him, sir. That'd settle the matter. Councillor or not, he'd not wriggle out of it." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, "but a wriggle can be most instructive. Let us not be hasty. Besides, an accusation made too early is like a pudding served half-cooked. It satisfies nobody and makes everyone sick." Meanwhile, the gossip mill continued to grind. Mrs. Gloss informed her customers that Brindle had been seen in deep conversation with the canon, an encounter she embellished into a secret bargain. Others whispered that Mrs. Keeble, desperate for recognition, might have tried to curry favour by intercepting the donation. The theories multiplied like ivy, climbing walls of fact that could no longer be seen beneath. By Thursday, Purbright felt it time to confront Brindle politely. He invited the councillor to his office, where Brindle arrived in his best suit as though for a portrait. "Councillor," Purbright began gently, "you were near the stall when the envelope vanished. You were also observed patting your pockets. And I hear you made a deposit at the bank the very next day. How do you explain these coincidences?" Brindle's face coloured, his waistcoat visibly rising and falling. "Inspector, are you insinuating that I, an elected member of the Borough Council, stooped to pocketing parish funds? I shall not dignify it with outrage, only with pity for your misguided suspicion." Purbright let the silence gather, then said softly, "Convenient suspects are dangerous things, councillor. They can so easily turn into inconvenient facts." Brindle shifted, muttered about business dealings, and blustered that the deposit was from a perfectly ordinary transaction, nothing to do with church matters. He refused, however, to specify further. As the councillor departed, full of indignation and perspiration, Purbright made a fresh note. Brindle's evasion had been instructive, not proof, but a performance. That night, as he walked through the square, Purbright reflected on the nature of appearances in Flaxborough. The canon, with his 2 ledgers, was terrified of seeming dishonest even if he was not. Brindle, with his pockets, was terrified of being caught dishonest even if he was. And somewhere between their fears, the truth was waiting for him, modest and unremarkable, like a brown envelope in a pile of programs. The councillor's performance in Purbright's office had been as vigorous as it was inconclusive, and by Friday morning Flaxborough had already adopted the notion that Brindle was either a saviour of parish morals or the chief architect of its downfall. Depending on one's preferred shop counter, he was credited with saving the canon from humiliation by temporarily sheltering the envelope, or denounced as a man who had fattened himself with ecclesiastical pounds. Both explanations carried the air of certainty with which townsfolk embroidered their ignorance. Inspector Purbright, unperturbed by the shifting tide of local conviction, turned his attention to something that had lingered in his mind since first hearing of the affair. It was not Brindle's evasions nor the canon's tremors, but a trivial observation made by Mrs. Keeble during her anxious protestations. She had said that she went near the cake stall only to ask Mrs. Porritt whether the canon had liked her gin entry. The detail had sounded harmless enough at the time, yet Purbright found himself dwelling on it now, because at no point in his conversations with the canon had there been mention of sampling anyone's sloe gin. On the surface, this was nothing more than the kind of polite self-delusion Flaxborough folk often practiced, convincing themselves their offerings were the highlight of any event. But it had been the way Mrs. Keeble recounted it, too exact, too carefully planted, that caused him to wonder. He decided to seek her out again, this time at her own home. The widow Keeble lived in a semi-detached house, whose curtains bore the yellowing weight of unshaken lace. She welcomed the inspector with a flutter of hands and apologies for the state of the place, though it was immaculate. Over weak tea, served in cups that rattled against saucers from nerves rather than age, Purbright allowed her to chatter. She spoke again of her gin, of her wish that the canon had found it refreshing, and of her concern for his health under the burden of scandal. But when Purbright asked whether she had spoken to anyone else near the stall that day, she faltered and confessed that she had exchanged a few words with Councillor Brindle, who had seemed very preoccupied. He had even asked whether she thought Mrs. Porritt kept careful track of all the envelopes she was given. The remark, though minor, was enough to make Purbright pause. Brindle, inquiring about the fate of envelopes before one had disappeared, suggested curiosity in advance of opportunity. He filed it away as one of those small details that might, at the right moment, become telling. Leaving Mrs. Keeble's, he walked slowly back across the town, stopping to watch a group of shopkeepers in lively debate. The current version of the story, it appeared, had the envelope stuffed with promissory notes linked to a shadowy property deal. Purbright could not help but admire the town's industry of invention. It was almost a pity that facts would eventually spoil such artistry. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Love thumping a typewriter with grim satisfaction. Love reported that opinion was hardening against young Derrick, largely because he fitted the profile of the kind of person who might be blamed without protest. A deputation of respectable ladies had even called to suggest remedial measures for the boy's wayward tendencies. Purbright listened politely, but shook his head. The eagerness with which the town points at him, Love, persuades me that he is the least likely culprit. Guilt seldom finds such quick unanimity. That evening, Purbright strolled once more to the vicarage, finding Canon Burrows sunk deep in his armchair, the ledgers open on his lap like penitential texts. The canon looked up, weary-eyed. "Inspector, I fear the parish is dissolving into malice. Each day there are more whispers, more accusations. Some even hint that I contrived the whole thing to cover debts." "It is dreadful." Purbright studied him carefully. "Canon, did you ever speak to anyone other than Mrs. Porritt about the envelope before the show?" Burrows hesitated, then admitted that he might have mentioned it to one of the church wardens in passing, though he could not remember which. He was vague, distracted by the chorus of disapproval around him. His memory, like his sermons, seemed to be delivered in half-sentences. Purbright left the vicarage with the sense that the canon's innocence lay not in certainty, but in confusion. The man might have mismanaged accounts, but deception required clarity, and clarity was the one thing he lacked. As he walked past the square, Purbright's eyes settled on the notice board outside the citizen office. A new headline declared, "Envelope still missing, council to demand inquiry." Below it, a smaller notice announced that the bishop's emissary would visit St. Matthew's the following week. The machinery of scandal was gaining momentum. It was then that Purbright's mind returned to Mrs. Keeble's little remark. Why insist that she had asked after her gin at the cake stall when no one had mentioned tasting it? Why tie herself so firmly to the canon's supposed enjoyment? It was not evidence of theft, perhaps, but of someone anxious to fix her place in the narrative. People often betrayed themselves not by what they hid, but by what they needlessly displayed. He also considered Brindle's question to her about envelopes and the bank deposit. These strands did not yet tie neatly together, but they hinted at more than mere coincidence. Brindle's pockets, Keeble's anxiety, the canon's bewilderment, each was a clue of a kind, but which was the trivial oddity that would unlock the rest? As Purbright reached the quiet of his own home, he allowed himself a small, private smile. The case was not one of grand crime, nor would it shake the nation. But it carried the peculiar charm of Flaxborough mysteries, the way human weakness, dressed up in petty respectability, left trails as visible as footprints on damp grass. He knew with the calm patience that was his habit that the odd detail he sought would soon declare itself fully. Until then, he would let the town talk itself hoarse, for in their talk the guilty always betrayed themselves sooner or later. Saturday dawned with a sky the colour of weak porridge, which suited the town's mood well. The gossip had reached its most industrious pitch, and one could hardly cross the square without overhearing some new certainty expressed in tones of weary authority. At the bakery, a customer assured the queue that the canon was about to resign. Outside the library, a retired schoolmistress whispered that the bishop intended to close St. Matthew's altogether. At the bus stop, someone declared it was all the work of outsiders, though who these outsiders were, or what interest they might have in envelopes, no one could say. Inspector Purbright moved gently among these currents, neither discouraging nor encouraging them. He understood too well the utility of rumour. It was like wind on water, making ripples that showed where objects lay beneath. A sudden rush of talk around one figure often betrayed a guilty conscience there, or at least an anxious one. By mid-morning he had arranged to meet with Mr. Hargreaves, the moustached churchwarden, who had earlier hinted at Brindle's opportunism. They sat together in the vestry, the smell of hymnals and furniture polish clinging heavily to the air. "Mr. Hargreaves," Purbright began, "you mentioned the possibility that Councillor Brindle liked to make capital out of appearances. I wonder if you could tell me a little more about his connection with parish matters." Hargreaves shifted on the narrow chair, pulling at his moustache as if seeking answers within it. "Brindle's taken more interest than usual these last months. Talks about financial transparency, which sounds fine until you see him positioning himself as the man to provide it. He fancies himself as guardian of public virtue, if you ask me, always about when there's money changing hands. He's even suggested we let the borough council supervise parish events. That would be unusual, Purbright observed. Unusual and unwelcome. Still, he has a knack for pushing himself in, and people, well, some admire his energy, others say it's self-advertisement. Purbright let this hang for a moment. And Mrs. Keeble, how is she regarded? Ah, poor soul, means well. Lonely, I suppose, always anxious to be seen as useful. She'll donate gin to every fair and raffle from here to Lincoln if it means someone thanks her. But she's harmless, Inspector. Harmless, perhaps, Purbright thought, but capable of inserting herself where she did not belong, then justifying it afterwards with an innocent, seeming remark. He filed it quietly beside Brindle's manoeuvres. Later that day, he returned to the police station where Sergeant Love awaited with his customary scowl of practicality. Love reported that the Citizen's latest edition had carried a letter to the editor suggesting Derrick should be disciplined with appropriate severity for his supposed theft. "The town's made up its mind, sir," Love said with satisfaction. "Best to act before they start taking matters into their own hands." "And what would you suggest, Love? Bring him in, charge him, even if it doesn't stick. It'll calm things down. Folk don't want mysteries, they want villains." Purbright smiled faintly. "Yes, but villains of their choosing, and it so happens I prefer the truth to a consensus." Love looked unconvinced, but Purbright had learned long ago that patient skepticism unsettled the guilty more than hasty accusations ever could. That evening, Purbright accepted an invitation to tea at the home of Mrs. Gloss, who had taken upon herself the role of chronicler in chief of the scandal. She offered him fruitcake of a density that seemed designed to test the strength of parishioners' molars, and while he nibbled politely, she discoursed at length on her theories. "It's my belief," she said, lowering her voice, though her neighbours could easily have heard through the thin wall, "that Brindle has used the money to curry favour with certain committees. They say he intends to stand for mayor next year. Imagine, Mayor Brindle! Though, mind you, Mrs. Keeble was fluttering about far too much that afternoon. She might well have moved the envelope without realizing its importance. Some people are like that. Heedless, careless. But you'll know better, Inspector. You always do." Purbright gave no encouragement, merely smiling at the thought of being Flaxborough's preferred receptacle for every theory. Yet her chatter confirmed one thing: the town was preparing itself for a revelation, and when towns prepared themselves, they often revealed more than they intended. On his way back across the square, Purbright stopped before the darkened Citizen office. In its window, the headline remained, "Mystery Grows Deeper." The reflection of the gaslight made the words shimmer, and Purbright thought how true it was that the mystery seemed to grow not because of facts, but because of people's eagerness to embroider them. The theft itself was a small stone. The town had built around it a cathedral of conjecture. He paused, then looked up at the looming shape of the vicarage beyond. The canon's silhouette was once again visible in the study window, bent over the ledgers. It struck Purbright that the man's plight was not of his own making alone. He was a vessel into which others poured their ambitions, fears, and suspicions. Brindle saw an opportunity to magnify his own virtue. Keeble sought recognition in her fussing. Porritt, defensive and precise, had perhaps overplayed her role as custodian. Each, in their way, had handled that envelope, if not literally, then symbolically, and yet it was still the trivial oddity that nagged him. Mrs. Keeble's insistence on the canon's appreciation of her gin, a detail no one had asked about. It was a tiny mismatch, a hairline crack in the plaster of her story. Purbright knew such cracks widened if one pressed gently at the right moment. Back at his desk he wrote 2 names at the top of his blotter, Brindle and Keeble. Underneath he added a third in a smaller script, Porrit. He stared at them for a long while, listening to the faint tick of the station clock. Each represented not simply a suspect, but a human frailty wrapped in respectability. One feared exposure, one craved importance, and one demanded control. The envelope, he thought, was less a prize than a mirror. Whoever had taken it had not acted for wealth alone. They had acted to protect or preserve something fragile, an image, a reputation, or perhaps a sense of belonging. He laid down his pen and leaned back. The town might continue spinning its stories, but Purbright knew the truth would lie in the smallest movement, the oddest remark, the detail overlooked. That was always where human nature betrayed itself. He only needed to wait for the right conversation, the right glance, and the whole weave would begin to unravel. Sunday morning in Flaxborough rarely promised excitement, but this one did not even wait until the bells rang to stir the town from its indolence. Shortly after dawn, word began trickling from the vicarage that something more had gone amiss. By the time Inspector Purbright received the call from Sergeant Love, who delivered it with a tone suggesting divine confirmation of his suspicions, half the town already knew that the canon's study had been broken into. When Purbright arrived, he found the canon pale and tremulous, standing before the desk where the 2 ledgers normally sat. One remained in its usual place, the official account book, but the second, the so-called Parish Social Fund ledger, had vanished. The canon wrung his hands in misery. "They have taken it, Inspector. The one book that would show my good faith, the one that could prove I meant no concealment. What is to become of me now?" Purbright examined the scene. There were no broken locks, only a window left unlatched, though whether by accident or intention was uncertain. A few papers lay scattered, but nothing else seemed touched. The act had been purposeful, directed at the single ledger. Superintendent Bradley, who arrived with his usual snort of impatience, surveyed the scene with grim satisfaction. "Well, Purbright, this settles it. Whoever took the envelope wanted to cover their tracks. Now the ledger's gone too, clearly an inside job. Canon, your house isn't a railway station. You should keep your windows locked." The canon looked close to collapse, murmuring half prayers. Purbright quietly guided him into a chair, then turned his gaze back to the window. No footprints marked the soft earth outside, no signs of force. It suggested to him not a burglar scaling walls at night, but someone perfectly comfortable entering the vicarage by ordinary means. As Bradley bellowed for immediate statements from every servant and parish helper, Purbright stood silent, letting the canon's panic fill the room. The disappearance of the ledger was far more significant than the loss of an envelope of notes. It meant someone feared exposure not only of theft, but of some entry within that second book. By late morning, news of the incident had burst upon the town like a hymn sung off. Key. In the square, the townsfolk gathered in clusters of eager voices. It was said the canon had burnt the ledger himself in despair. It was said the ledger contained names of donors who preferred their generosity to remain private, names now exposed to ridicule. It was said, by those who liked their tales spiced, that the ledger contained payments to women whose services could hardly be described as social. At the police station, Sergeant Love had already prepared a triumphant case against young Derrick. "The boy was seen loitering last night near the churchyard," he announced. "And he's been known to break into sheds. Fits the bill, sir. Pinched the ledger to make mischief after the envelope business." "Perhaps," Purbright said mildly, "though one wonders what he would do with a parish ledger. Read it at bedtime?" Love scowled. "He could have sold it for paper, sir, or maybe to a newspaper man." Purbright smiled faintly, but his thoughts were elsewhere. A boy might steal buns or mischief, but this theft carried intent. Someone had removed the ledger to erase or to hold hostage its entries. That required knowledge of what it contained. In the afternoon, Purbright paid another visit to Mrs. Porritt. He found her tight-lipped, even more defensive than before. When told of the ledger's disappearance, she stiffened visibly. "Well, Inspector, I cannot say I am surprised. Records attract meddling eyes. Some people, you see, cannot bear to have everything set down in black and white." "Would you be one of those people, Mrs. Porritt?" Purbright asked gently. She flushed, but maintained her composure. "I am meticulous, Inspector, ask anyone, but there are those who dislike my methods. They prefer vagueness, so they can do as they please. The canon's second book was bound to cause offence in certain quarters." Her remark was sharp enough to suggest personal grievance. Purbright noted it with interest, though he gave no sign. Later that evening, he encountered Councillor Brindle outside the Midland Bank, puffing with indignation. "First an envelope, now a ledger," Brindle exclaimed, his voice pitched to carry to the ears of passers-by. "The parish must be cleaned up, Inspector, cleaned up thoroughly. I've already written to the bishop to demand an inquiry. Mark my words, this is the moment for firm civic leadership." "And perhaps a mayoral one?" Purbright asked lightly. Brindle blinked, then laughed too heartily. "Oh, come now, Inspector, I only seek the welfare of the town." As the councillor waddled away, Purbright reflected that ambition made men careless. Brindle's eagerness to exploit each turn of events suggested more than innocence. He was shaping himself as a moral champion, but champions rarely stood so close to the loot. The day closed with Purbright reviewing his notes in the quiet of his office. The theft of the ledger had widened the field rather than narrowed it. Brindle stood out with his bank deposit and grandstanding. Porritt's defensiveness hinted at her own secrets. Mrs. Keeble, with her misplaced anxiety, still troubled him. And now the canon himself looked increasingly fragile, his weakness making him a liability to those who thrived on control. Purbright leaned back in his chair, smoke curling from his pipe. Two crimes had now been committed, the missing envelope and the stolen ledger. They were not separate, but a sequence. The first had raised suspicion, the second had been committed to erase or redirect it. Together they told him something crucial, that the thief feared exposure not to the town at large, but to the intimate pages of that book. Somewhere among the neat columns of names and sums lay the kernel of motive. As he extinguished his lamp, Purbright felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The case had ceased to be a matter of missing paper and had become a portrait of human folly. And in Flaxborough, folly was the most common crime of all. The disappearance of the ledger had left the canon a shadow of himself, pacing his study like a penitent, rehearsing an endless confession. When Purbright next visited him, late on Monday evening, he found the clergyman staring at the remaining account book as though it might accuse him by association. The canon's speech was halting, his hands damp with fretful gesturing. "Inspector, without that ledger I cannot defend myself. People will say it contained proof of irregularities. They will assume I destroyed it, or had it destroyed. I am helpless." Purbright, settling into a chair with unhurried calm, said, "Helplessness, Canon, is a very persuasive disguise. It is also a dangerous one. Those who are truly guilty seldom appear so broken." Burrows shook his head, not understanding, or perhaps unwilling to. He muttered something about providence and the fickleness of public trust, then begged the inspector to find the book before the bishop's emissary arrived. Purbright made no promises, merely inclining his head in sympathetic patience. When he left the vicarage, the autumn evening hung heavy with damp. The lamps glowed against mist, and the square echoed faintly with footsteps of townsfolk still circulating rumours like traders haggling over worn goods. Purbright paused to listen. Brindle's name featured frequently, sometimes as villain, sometimes as saviour. Mrs. Porritt's meticulousness was cast as obsessive concealment. Derek was still the favoured scapegoat among those who preferred their culprits conveniently young and voiceless. Yet it was Mrs. Keeble whose name surfaced in unexpected places, always with pitying tones, as though her fluttering nervousness made her incapable of anything beyond fuss. That was precisely why she continued to interest Purbright. Back at his office, he sat alone with the blotter covered in notes. The two thefts had shifted his thinking from simple dishonesty to the subtler territory of motive. Money was too crude an explanation, not because £50 was trivial, but because the risk of stealing it was not worth the gain unless something more was at stake. And the ledger's disappearance pointed to reputation. Someone feared an entry within it that could not withstand scrutiny. Purbright reflected on each figure in turn. Brindle, with his bank deposit and noisy virtue, might easily have taken the envelope, but would he bother with the ledger unless it held something tying him directly? He was too public a man to risk carrying off evidence without some desperate need. Porritt, fiercely defensive of her orderliness, could have moved the envelope inadvertently, but theft of the ledger suggested a deliberate attempt to control narratives, and she was too bound by procedure for such boldness. As for Keeble, her odd anxiety, her insistence that the canon had admired her gin, seemed absurdly trivial until one considered the psychology of lonely people, the desperate need to be noticed, to make themselves central to events. Could she have taken the envelope by impulse, then panicked when the ledger threatened to expose her presence? Purbright let his pipe smoke curl in the dim lamplight, contemplating how small vanities often bloomed into crimes. In Flaxborough, people seldom killed for gain, but reputations had been quietly buried more effectively than anybody. The thefts, he thought, were less about money than about preserving an image in a town where every whisper magnified. The following morning he walked to the Midland Bank under the pretence of personal business. The manager, a cautious man whose spectacles magnified his suspicion, spoke guardedly, but not without relish. Yes, Councillor Brindle had made a deposit shortly after the flower show. Yes, it was somewhat mixed in denominations. No, he would not suggest impropriety, but the timing was certainly curious. Purbright thanked him with courteous vagueness, leaving the manager disappointed not to have provoked more reaction. That afternoon, Purbright called again on Mrs. Keeble. She greeted him with nervous eagerness, as though desperate for his approval. Her sitting room was over, decorated with lace and photographs of long, dead relations. She served him tea so sweet it made his teeth ache. "I do hope," she began at once, "that you are making progress. The canon is such a dear man, and it would be dreadful if anyone thought he'd behaved improperly. You must find the truth, Inspector, you always do." Purbright let her chatter until she mentioned once more the canon's supposed enjoyment of her gin. This time he asked mildly, "Mrs. Keeble, how exactly did the canon describe it to you?" She hesitated, colour rising to her cheeks. "Oh, he said it was refreshing, I think." "Did he indeed?" Purbright's tone was polite, but the pause that followed unsettled her. She fluttered with excuses. Perhaps he had been distracted, perhaps she had misremembered. Yet her need to place herself at the canon's attention was as clear as the rattling teacup in her hand. Leaving her house, Purbright considered the small crack widening. Why insist on such a detail? Why fix her story with unnecessary embroidery? He knew from long experience that when people repeated falsehoods, they laced them with decoration. It was never the bare lie but the carefully arranged flourish that betrayed them. By evening, the town was buzzing with news that the bishop's emissary would arrive within days. Pressure mounted. The council was preparing for a public inquiry. The citizen promised a full exposé, and Brindle strutted about as though already elected mayor. Amid this noise, Purbright moved with the calm of a man listening for a whisper beneath the shouting. He returned to the vicarage once more, not to interrogate, but to observe. He watched as the canon, shoulders bent under invisible weight, greeted parishioners who came under the guise of sympathy, but left with fresh material for speculation. He noticed how Porritt hovered, fierce in her order, as if guarding not only the canon, but her own sense of superiority. And he noted, too, the way Brindle arrived with exaggerated concern, making sure his visit was seen by as many eyes as possible. In those moments, Purbright saw the pattern more clearly. The thefts were not isolated acts. They were the town's own vanities laid bare, each suspect driven by a different kind of fear or craving. The canon feared exposure, Brindle feared obscurity, Porritt feared disorder, and Keble feared invisibility. Each had reason, each had opportunity, but only one would have found both thefts necessary. As Purbright walked home through the misty square, the church bell chimed faintly overhead. He thought of the missing ledger, the vanished envelope, the town's chorus of theories. Slowly, with the patience that had long been his strength, he began to frame the quiet test that would reveal the truth. It would not be a trap of violence or confrontation, but a question, posed at just the right moment, that would expose the guilty not by what they confessed, but by what they could not disguise. The bishop's emissary was due to arrive in 2 days, and with him, no doubt, would come the pomp of ecclesiastical authority and the appetite for a clean resolution, however approximate to the truth. Purbright knew that once higher dignitaries interfered, the subtleties of Flaxborough human nature would be flattened into official statements, and with that, the truth would risk being lost beneath ceremony. He therefore resolved that the matter must be coaxed toward revelation before the emissary set foot in the town. The question was how to do so. He had suspects aplenty. Brindle, with his bulging pockets and convenient deposit. Mrs. Porritt, with her brittle precision. Mrs. Keble, with her trembling vanity. Even the canon, whose weakness might have led him into compromises others had exploited. Each one could plausibly have removed the envelope, and each might equally have had reason to remove the ledger. But Purbright had learned that guilt in Flaxborough was not about plausibility. It was about small slips of behaviour, the stray word that unravelled a careful performance. On Tuesday morning, he sent Sergeant Love to pay a social call on Mrs. Keble under the pretext of checking her recollections again. Purbright knew Love's bluntness often unsettled people, and he was curious to see whether the widow's fluttering would harden into defensiveness. She received Love with flustered smiles, answered questions with vague certainties, and then, quite without prompting, repeated again that the canon had complimented her gin. Love, whose palate could detect only 2 states of alcohol, present or absent, saw nothing remarkable in this but dutifully reported the repetition back to his superior. Purbright smiled thinly, certain now that she was binding herself to a falsehood. Yet Keble alone did not explain the ledger's disappearance. That pointed to a hand more calculating, less impulsive. Brindle's eagerness to exploit events made him likely, but Purbright suspected that the counsellor would have preferred to let the ledger exist as a weapon to be flourished at the right moment. Destroying it removed its usefulness, unless, of course, it contained something damning for him personally. That afternoon, Purbright convened a quiet gathering in the parish hall. He invited the canon, Brindle, Porritt, and Keble, presenting the meeting as a private discussion intended to clarify certain details before the bishop's representative arrived. The canon came reluctantly, pale and near collapse. Brindle arrived brisk and self-important, booming greetings. Porritt was rigid with indignation at the implied suspicion. Keble arrived flustered, clasping her handbag as though it contained absolution. Purbright welcomed them with his customary calm and began with innocuous questions, where each had been during the flower show, what they had seen near the stall, how they regarded the two ledgers. He listened with serene patience, letting them contradict themselves gently, never interrupting, never pressing too hard. Brindle grew pompous in his insistence on moral reform. Porritt bristled whenever the word mistake was mentioned. Keble, as before, insisted on the canon's fondness for her gin, the phrase tumbling out as if rehearsed. Then Purbright asked, in a voice as mild as a vicar's blessing, "Do any of you happen to recall the sequence of envelopes given to Mrs. Porritt that afternoon? Not their contents, merely the order?" The question hung innocently enough, yet it stirred discomfort. Brindle frowned, muttering about not watching such trivialities. Porritt sniffed, declaring she had kept the strictest order possible under chaotic circumstances. But it was Keble who shifted, colour draining from her cheeks. She stammered that she remembered perfectly, but then faltered, unable to provide even the simplest sequence. Her eyes darted, searching for rescue, but none came. Purbright let the silence stretch before turning his gaze kindly toward her. "Mrs. Keble, you have been most anxious that the canon's approval of your gin be remembered. An odd thing, since he does not drink spirits. I wonder why you feel it necessary to insist upon it." She gasped, clutching her bag tighter. "But he said—" Purbright's tone remained gentle. "No, Mrs. Keble, he did not, and I believe you know that. You wished to be included, to be seen, to matter. And in that wish you found yourself near the stall, nearer than you care to admit. You took the envelope, perhaps impulsively, perhaps thinking it unimportant. Later, when the canon's ledger threatened to reveal you had handled such things before, your name, perhaps written there for small donations, you panicked, and so the ledger, too, disappeared. The room held its breath. The canon blinked in astonishment. Brindle puffed with outrage. Porritt looked vindicated. Mrs. Keble trembled, then burst into tears, the handbag sliding from her lap. From it, as though staging its own confession, a folded sheet of paper slipped to the floor. Purbright stooped and picked it up with slow courtesy. It was a page torn from the missing ledger, listing small donations, among them Mrs. A. Keble, tutelar for choir robes. No one spoke. The evidence was neither dramatic nor damning, but it was enough. She had taken the ledger not to profit, but to hide her own silly pretense of larger generosity, fearing the exposure of her modest contribution. The envelope, too, had been a grasp for notice that had spiraled into calamity. Purbright closed the page carefully and returned it to her trembling hands. "There are crimes of greed, Mrs. Keble, and there are crimes of vanity. Yours is the latter. It will be treated accordingly." The canon sagged with relief. Brindle muttered about wasted time. Porritt sat rigid in righteous satisfaction. Purbright, unhurried as ever, only remarked that the truth, once untangled, was rarely so grand as the stories woven around it, and with that the net had drawn in its catch. Not a villain of melodrama, but a lonely widow whose small hunger to be noticed had set the whole town whispering. Outside, as they dispersed, the square hummed with the beginnings of a new round of gossip. The tale would grow again, no doubt, acquiring embellishments of conspiracy, corruption, and heroism. But Purbright, lighting his pipe, thought only how fragile human pride could be, and how often it masqueraded as sin far greater than itself. The confession, if such it could be called, had left the little gathering in the parish hall subdued and oddly dissatisfied. There had been no dramatic outburst, no thunderclap of exposure, only the sight of poor Mrs. Keble dissolving into tears, her foolishness exposed with the tenderness of a surgeon uncovering a splinter. The canon, pale but calmer, had offered halting reassurances, though they did little to quiet the tremors that still shook her shoulders. Brindle, meanwhile, stalked out muttering about wasted opportunities, his sense of theatre spoiled by the inspector's untheatrical revelation. Purbright, having guided the meeting to its quiet close, walked back across the square in the dusk, pipe smoke curling about his face. He felt the case was nearly done, yet not fully. Mrs. Keble had indeed taken the envelope, he had little doubt of that now, and her panic at the ledger was telling. But there lingered a question that would not dissolve so easily. Who had chosen to magnify the theft, to turn a small, pitiable impulse into a scandal that threatened to swallow the canon's reputation whole? For the widow, left alone with her lace curtains and her gin bottles, could never have wielded such influence. She might start a ripple, but others had seized it and made a tide. And Purbright knew that in Flaxborough a tide was always summoned by those who hoped to float upon it. The following day he paid a call upon Councillor Brindle at his office, a room cluttered with civic paraphernalia, commemorative plaques, photographs of ribbon-dot cuttings, and a faint smell of cigars. Brindle received him with the air of a man reluctantly indulging a subordinate. "Inspector," he boomed, "I trust we are nearing the end of this sordid business. The town clamours for resolution. The bishop's man will want a clear report." Purbright inclined his head. "The truth is often clear, Councillor, though not always convenient. I wonder, for instance, why you were so swift to raise this matter before the council chamber, and why the citizen was so well informed of your opinions." Brindle puffed, reddening. "A councillor has a duty to safeguard the town's moral standing. Public confidence must be maintained. I merely acted responsibly." "Responsibility," Purbright murmured, "is a curious word. Sometimes it disguises ambition." Brindle waved the remark aside, but grew visibly uncomfortable. When pressed about his bank deposit, he launched into a speech about a private inheritance transaction, which he declined to detail further. Purbright let him thunder on, noting only how carefully the councillor avoided a direct answer. Later that afternoon, Purbright strolled by the offices of the Citizen, where the editor, Mr. Wemyss, greeted him with eager obsequiousness. Wemyss, who enjoyed nothing more than supplying the town with a rolling chorus of insinuations, hinted that his sources were very highly placed. Under the inspector's mild gaze, he admitted that Councillor Brindle had been remarkably helpful in providing context. Purbright left him with a quiet smile, the pieces fitting neatly into place. The theft itself had been petty, born of Mrs. Keble's foolish craving for notice. But the scandal that followed, the cries of irregularity, the demands for inquiry, those had been Brindle's doing. He had seized upon the theft not to solve it but to shape it, building himself up as defender of probity, while secretly fearing his own name might yet emerge in the accounts. The ledger's disappearance, then, might have served two purposes: to silence Keble's panic, and to ensure that Brindle's own financial dabblings remained conveniently obscured. That evening, Purbright returned to the vicarage to speak privately with the canon. He found him calmer now, relieved that suspicion no longer clung so closely. Yet the man's shoulders still sagged beneath invisible burdens. "Inspector," Burrows said quietly, "I owe you more than thanks. Without your patience, I should have been ruined by gossip alone." Purbright looked at the weary clergyman with gentle sympathy. "Canon, you may find in the future that transparency is less dangerous than secrecy. Two ledgers are two opportunities for confusion. Still, I believe your parish will forgive in time. They are fond of scandal, but they are equally fond of moving on." The canon smiled weakly, his relief plain, though Purbright knew that reputations in Flaxborough seldom healed without scars. As he walked home, Purbright reflected on the curious balance of the case. The crime itself was small, yet the shadow it cast was large. A lonely widow's vanity, a counsellor's ambition, a secretary's defensiveness, each had played its part in weaving a fabric of suspicion. And beneath it all, the town itself had proved once more its talent for transforming trifles into theatre. The inspector knew there was one step yet to take. The bishop's emissary would soon arrive expecting answers, and Purbright intended to provide them, not in melodrama, but in quiet clarity, where each thread of human folly was drawn together. He had no taste for public humiliation, but he would see the guilty confronted with themselves gently but unmistakably. The next day, he drafted a polite request for the canon to host a final meeting in the vicarage study. The participants would be the same as before: Brindle, Porritt, Keble, and the canon himself. The ledger might still be missing, but Purbright had all, the evidence he required, both written and unwritten. As he sealed the note, he considered again the nature of his work. Detectives in novels were thought to hunt for daggers and fingerprints. In Flaxborough, the clues were smaller, softer, an anxious word repeated too often, a counsellor's hand hovering over his pocket, a widow's vanity blossoming into theft. These were his fingerprints, and they always left a mark. With that, he laid aside his pen, his mind composed, his net drawn tight. The next gathering would not merely explain the thefts. It would reveal in the politest possible terms how pride and ambition had entangled a parish, and how a detective with patience enough to listen could disentangle them without raising his voice. The canon's study, with its worn carpet and faint smell of candle wax, was chosen for the final gathering. It was not so much a tribunal as a drawing together of loose threads, arranged with the quiet precision that was Inspector Purbright's preferred method. The bishop's emissary was due in the town the following day, and Purbright had no intention of leaving the matter for dignitaries to embroider into solemn pronouncements. Better to settle it now in the company of those most intimately entangled. They assembled in the late afternoon. The canon, trembling but steadier than he had been in weeks, sat by the fire, clutching his spectacles as though they might serve as a shield. Mrs. Porritt perched the bolt upright, her handbag resting like a weapon on her lap, eyes sharp with indignation. Councillor Brindle, resplendent in a suit that strained at the buttons, exuded an air of forced magnanimity, as if ready to forgive the guilty once Purbright identified them, provided the guilty were not himself. And Mrs. Keble, pale and fluttering, clutched her handkerchief in both hands, her gaze sliding nervously between her companions. Purbright stood near the desk where one ledger still remained. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and let silence linger until even Brindle's bluster withered under the weight of waiting. "You are all aware," he began with calm courtesy, "that two disturbances have troubled this parish. First, the disappearance of an envelope containing a donation. Second, the vanishing of a ledger meant to record social funds. At first glance, these might seem unrelated or merely accidents of poor management. But Flaxborough seldom allows accidents to stand alone. They are woven, each to the other, by the hand of human nature." He let his words settle before turning to Mrs. Keble. "Madam, you wished so fervently for the canon's approval of your gin that you repeated it until it became, in your mind, fact. But he never praised it. Your insistence betrayed the truth, that you had been near the stall closer than you admitted. The envelope tempted you, perhaps not for gain, but for notice. You took it, imagining it a trifling act. When you realized its importance, you panicked. Later, the ledger threatened to expose your smallness, to reveal that your contributions were not the grand gestures you wished them to be. So the ledger, too, was taken. Mrs. Keeble gasped, eyes wide, and then broke into quiet sobs. "I only wanted to be thought of," she whispered. Purbright's voice remained gentle. "And in seeking that, you found yourself at the centre of scandal. A small act can cast a long shadow when a town hungers for stories." He allowed her words to fade before turning his gaze upon Councillor Brindle. But Mrs. Keeble's theft alone would not have grown to such a storm. Scandal requires cultivation. Councillor, you seized upon the missing envelope to thrust yourself forward as guardian of morality. You gave the citizen material, you fanned the rumours, and you shaped the narrative to your own advantage. You wished the parish to appear in peril so that you might ride to its rescue. And when the ledger vanished, you found it useful, for it removed the possibility that your own name, appearing among the donors in ways you would rather not explain, might be questioned. Brindle surged to his feet, face crimson. "Inspector, I will not—" "You will sit," Purbright said softly. The quiet authority in his tone pressed Brindle back into his chair. "Your bank deposit, made the morning after the flower show, was suspiciously timed. Though I cannot prove it contained the stolen notes, the appearance was enough. And you, Councillor, are a man who thrives on appearances." The room was still. The canon stared into the fire, as if praying silently for deliverance. Mrs. Porritt, sharp-eyed and tight-lipped, looked vindicated. Mrs. Keeble sobbed softly, her vanity stripped bare. Brindle fumed but offered no further protest, his outrage blunted by the inspector's implacable calm. Purbright drew once on his pipe before continuing. "Thus we see the pattern. A lonely woman's vanity sparked the theft. A councillor's ambition magnified it into scandal. A secretary's severity, a canon's weakness, a town's appetite for gossip. These furnished the rest. None of you alone could have created such a disorder. Together, however, you made a parish tremble over a small brown envelope." He paused, then added in his mildest tone, "And now the matter is concluded. The donation will be restored, the ledger reconstructed as best it can from memory, and the bishop's emissary informed that no great crime has occurred here, only a human one." There was no applause, no drama, only the shifting of feet and the faint sound of Mrs. Keeble's weeping. Brindle muttered something about duty. Porritt pressed her lips into a thin line, and the canon finally exhaled, as though released from weeks of suffocation. When at last they departed, Purbright remained alone in the study. He gazed at the single surviving ledger, then at the empty space where its twin had stood. With quiet satisfaction, he reflected that justice in Flaxborough was not measured in courts or headlines, but in the slow exposure of vanity, fear, and pride. Outside, the town was already humming with fresh gossip. The story would be retold, embroidered, reshaped, Brindle's role magnified, Keeble's softened, the canons sermonized into an act of heroism. But Purbright, returning to his office, felt no need to correct them. His work was never to silence gossip, only to find the truth beneath it. He sat at his desk, filled in the necessary report, and returned to the comfort of paperwork. Another case filed, another tangle of human frailty gently unwound. In Flaxborough, he knew, there would always be another,